Dear younger me, I'm writing to you at a time you had a paradigm that didn't belong. You thought we needed to move on without acknowledging our history. So let me briefly explain why you were wrong. Hi there, I'm Jim Thunder, and welcome to another video this week. We're continuing on in the video series of explaining each portion of my spoken word poem called Dear Younger Me, a letter to my younger self. In this section, we're talking about the idea to leave behind in order to decolonize our mind, being that the treaties were legal, both sides were equal, and natives were fairly treated. So the key phrase that I want to highlight in this section is that legality is not the same as fairness, and I'll explain what I mean as we go through the video. First of all, we need to begin by discussing what is terra nullius and what is the doctrine of discovery, and where did it come from. So the doctrine of discovery came from a series of papal bulls. The church was issuing these papal bulls during the Age of Discovery. As new lands and countries and territories were being discovered, there needed to be some kind of a legal prerequisite for them to be able to claim these lands as their own. What is the doctrine of discovery? The doctrine of discovery holds that lands that were discovered could be claimed by those who discovered. It's closely related to this idea of terra nullius. So the word terra nullius, if you break it apart, terra meaning land, nullius meaning empty or void. The idea is that when lands are discovered, they are empty, they are vacant, as long as they're not inhabited by Christians who are farming the land. So basically, the idea comes down to this. If you have indigenous inhabitants in the land who are not farming, according to terra nullius, they can be considered as flora and fauna. So think about that. So the indigenous inhabitants of the land are not even considered people according to the doctrine of terra nullius, which is related to our doctrine of discovery. So in the spoken word poem, I talk about Eddie Mabo, and I talk about colonialism in Australia. So basically, to explain this story in a little bit more detail, Eddie Mabo, he found himself working as a janitor in one of the universities in Australia. And as a janitor in this university, he came to this shocking discovery that the Australians thought that his home island, his island on Muir, didn't belong to him and his nation, but it belonged to Australia. And so he was incredibly perplexed by this. And so he took the time to figure out, looking at our laws, looking at terra nullius, looking at the doctrine of discovery, and looking at case law and the Commonwealth countries. And he spent his life working with university professors and so on to try to get them to, at the very least, recognize that his home island and his homelands belonged to him and his family and his nation. And the long story short, that just before he died, just before he passed away, the Supreme Court ruled in his favor. So he was a hero, and he'll always be remembered for that work. So I talk about this story because for me, this was the first time learning about Eddie Mabo's story was the first time I learned about the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. But so how does doctrine of discovery and terra nullius apply to us over here in Canada? In order to talk about that, we have to talk about how it relates to the United States. In the early 1800s, maybe 1823, there was a case that was brought up to the Supreme Court. It was McIntosh versus Johnson. And so what had happened was Johnson purchased land from the Native American tribes in a certain area. And McIntosh had bought the same land, but from the United States. And so it went up to the Supreme Court in order to determine who owns the land. And according to terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery, McIntosh won. And so that means it became case law. And because it became case law in this country, it became case law in the Commonwealth countries. So in Canada, it's not until recently that the Supreme Court here ruled terra nullius never applied in Canada. In 2014, the Tsilhqot'in Nation versus British Columbia recognized that based on this Royal Proclamation of 1763, terra nullius had no effect in the Canadian case law, and this was a huge step forward. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mentioned before about how there are 94 calls to action, talking about how we could advance reconciliation in this country. Number 46 calls for us to deny terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. So why does it matter? Reconciliation comes when we decolonize our mind. So getting rid of the idea that we are exploiting people or resources. It's the idea that we are moving forward together in a spirit of truth and reconciliation. Thanks for watching.